So my name's Rose. I'm representing the Neath Talbot Local Nature Partnership. So it's one of the nature partnerships. There are many across Wales in the national park authorities and the local authority areas. You can find the local nature partnership that's local to you by visiting the Wales Biodiversity Partnership website or the Local Nature Partnerships Cymru website, and you can find out a lot about the projects there. So with me tonight, we're going to talk about amphibians and reptiles, and we've got Mark Barber from Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust. He's going to introduce himself now, but start getting your questions in because we're going to start talking about it. So Mark, thank you very much for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about what you do and what your project is in Wales?
Cool, thank you, Rose. So we're a ARC Trust, Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust, are a national wildlife charity. We've been around for many years, but only more recently in southern Wales, so about 8 years now with my colleague Pete Hill. And so we've been on various different projects. A lot of them have been pond related. So we've created or restored or managed over 240 ponds over the past 8 years, and we're hoping with our new project, our new National Lottery Heritage Fund project called Connecting the Dragons, that we'll be digging another at least 100 ponds as part of that project over the next 3 years.
First off, can I just ask, what are the best things you can do in the garden for amphibians and reptiles, for your garden dragons? What's the best thing you can do?
So a really kind of easy hit in a way is a pond of some kind. I think we'll probably talk about ponds quite a lot over the next hour or so, but a pond of any kind would be great. I mentioned grass snakes, so compost heaps, piles of rotting vegetation. They need them to lay their eggs. So we can talk about that in more detail, but again, that's one which is something that's quite easy to achieve if you've got grass cuttings or just from composting your vegetable peelings. And then the other things, there's creating rubble piles and log piles as features for amphibians and reptiles to hide in. So that's another pretty handy thing to do.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so I did something similar to that recently. I made a wall in the garden that went through from my frog pond to other areas in the garden. So I'm hoping that they're all going to start moving into that soon.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll love it in there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've got some questions in. Thank you very much. So our first one is from Sandra Stewart, and she says that they have lots of frog spawn early in the year, but then they think that the newts eat them, or what? Is there anything they can do about that, or is there something they should do about that?
Well, this is quite a common question that we get across the UK, and often the case, I'm not sure about it in this example, but people dig a pond in their garden, and then very quickly common frogs find it and start spawning into it, and a population builds up. But then, over time, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But then, depending on the pond and on the situation, it might be 5, 10, 20 years, they start either having a slow drop-off or a relatively quick one, which seems relatively quick, where they're just either not getting as much spawn or they're not getting any little metamorphs, the frogs coming out of the pond. And so Sandra's kind of hit it on the head there. It is to do with the newts. That's often, as I say, the frogs build up their population first. The newts are a bit slower in terms of building up increasing their population connected to a particular new pond. And so, the newt population is slowly building up over that time period and eventually gets to such size that they basically consume all of either they can actually suck the eggs out of the frog spawn, or they eat the tadpoles. And so in a normal, more natural system where you maybe had a network of ponds and ditches and other little watery features, there's quite a lot of diversity for the frog population to survive. But if you've got one pond or even two ponds and they're that many in the surrounding landscape, then all of the newts congregate there. And unfortunately, over time, quite often they can completely knock out that frog population in that pond. In terms of what you can do about it, it can be tricky, but it depends how much people love their frogs, and a lot of people love the frogs in their garden. But really, the only way you can, well, one of the only ways you can do it is you can dig more ponds, in the hope that you're increasing the diversity, or if possible, but it might not be possible, making your pond more diverse by having more shallow areas where the tadpoles can get away from the newts and stuff like that. That can help, but normally doesn't completely solve the problem. The other option is to actually look after your frog spawn. And so I know a lot of people which want to keep frogs in their garden, they actually take some of the clumps, if they still have clumps left, from their pond and actually carefully raise them in some either a tank or even buckets, even inflatable garden pools for kids. Some people go completely wild for it, but basically a way to separate the newts from the frogs until the tadpoles can develop into little metamorphs and start wandering around. And so there's a lot of guidance online on how to look after tadpoles, and it is a great thing for kids to do. But obviously you have to make sure that you're thinking about the welfare of the animals and that you definitely look after them properly. But that is one of the only successful ways I've heard of people actually keeping frogs in their garden, if they can't dig more ponds or they can't encourage their neighbours to dig more ponds to kind of spread itself. So hopefully that's helpful for Sandra.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, I didn't know that they sort of sucked the eggs out of the spawn. That's quite horrible.
It's quite amazing if you're lucky and you know when some spawn's been laid relatively recently and you've definitely got newts in your pond. Then if you sit and observe, quite often you will see either palmates or smooths, and sometimes great crested newts, if you've got those actually crawling around in the clump and actually sucking them out.
We've got loads more questions coming in now. So Tim has asked, how can you tell the difference between slow worms and snakes?
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, so slow worms are not a worm, and they're also not a snake, so that they're a legless lizard. And really, it's a bit, obviously it does seem a bit confusing because it hasn't got any legs. It's a reptile. Looks like a snake. Why isn't a snake? But which is actually sometimes quite hard to explain the real path of that. But in terms of from an identification point of view, it doesn't really matter whether it's a lizard or whether it's a snake. It's really about the patternation. So slow worms are generally brown and grey in colour, and sometimes they have the females, they have dark sides, whereas the males don't have dark sides. And so really what you're looking for are the features that are missing. So when you've got the snake species, with the grass snake, which you often get in gardens, widespread species, very adaptable and love compost heaps and ponds because they feed on amphibians. So they're green in colour, or kind of olive green in colour, sometimes a bit brown looking, but normally a bit olive greeny generally, and they've got this collar pattern on the back of their head, these black and yellow markings, and then the adder has got the zigzag pattern down its back. So in terms of identification, it's kind of seeing that you're missing those key features. If it hasn't got a zigzag, it's definitely not an adder. If it doesn't have the black and yellow collar, it's definitely not a grass snake. So then you're pretty sure if you've got something brown, relatively small and quite shiny, then you've got a slow worm.
Next question we've got from Becky, and she's asking what would you say is the best garden pond liner?
Right. Okay. So it's a bit of a difficult one because from our perspective in ARC, when we're digging ponds, we try and dig ponds that naturally have deposits of clay under the soil and the subsoil, because it's just easier and cheaper. You've got basically a natural liner under the ground. obviously a lot of people don't live in areas where there are natural deposits of clay. If you do, like if you know your ground, maybe you think, oh, I've got very clay soil, so you might not even need a liner. And resources online, I think there's something called, I use it sometimes, the UK soil map, I think it's called, and you can look in your area to see if you do have clay underlying in your garden. But if you don't, which a lot of people sadly won't, then yeah, lining is the only option if you want a pond. So there's probably three main options I can think of right now. So there's the kind of pre-formed ponds, hard, rigid. You know, you have to dig out exactly the shape, and generally they have steps. So that they're quite good. I guess you're kind of lacking options in terms of deciding exactly how you want the pond to look. But it's helpful that it's ready and there to go. They're also very easy to clean because it's a really rigid, hard surface, so you don't need to worry about puncturing a material liner, which is one of the downsides of getting something like a butyl plastic liner. But I guess the other bad thing about the more preset ones is that normally they don't have very good shallow drawdown zones. So these edges of the water with very little kind of 1 to 5 centimeters of water are where a lot of interesting and rare plants and invertebrates like to live. Okay. And so you can have a pond with those, then that's all good. From an amphibian perspective, they're not as fussed with those shallow drawdown zones, so that isn't critical for them, and species don't necessarily, there aren't those. So that's that from that one. And then so with the butyl liner, then it's all of the kind of work of digging out the pond and getting all the margins right, putting down sand or some sort of membrane, and then putting that butyl liner down. The third and final option is something called bentomat, which is it looks like carpet, but it's got a layer of fabric and then a layer of like powdered clay, and then another layer of carpet, and then it actually expands to about 10 times its thickness with the water, and it makes this amazingly strong barrier. So that's kind of like a middle ground between having your own clay in the ground, or even because people used to bring in clay from areas where there wasn't clay and what they call puddle the clay to have a puddle clay pond, but that's quite expensive and quite hard work, so that's not normally something that normally happens. But this bentomat material, they quite often use it to make reservoirs, so it's supposed to be quite resilient and quite good. So but it's probably a little bit more expensive and harder to handle because it's unbelievably heavy. Okay. But it's definitely an option people should consider.
We've got loads of questions coming in, so we'll crack on. So next question we've got is what Laura is saying. My pond is about 10 years old and has lots of moss in it. I know that autumn is the best time to clear it out, but what would be the best way?
So autumn is definitely the best time to clear out your ponds, when most of the animals in there have finished their breeding cycles, and a lot of them will have left the pond. So normally we suggest that you only remove about 1/3 of the material at a time. So you could do 1/3 of the vegetation within a pond 1 year, and then if you're still feeling like the pond is quite overwhelmed with vegetation or a kind of silt and sludge, that every year for at least a couple of years until you clear it, you can remove 1/3. So that's probably the best way to deal with that. You can have issues with some species dominating if you've got quite a shaded pond, or if a lot of leaf litter falls into your pond. So the more nutrients in the pond, the quicker it succeeds and the quicker it fills up with vegetation, and the more shaded a pond is, the less diverse and the less kind of interesting species that will come in. So it's better if it's not shaded.
Okay. Yeah, I've experienced that recently. I just cleared the vegetation, so let some light into my pond, and the results of it have been immediate. The tadpoles were all basking in the sun, so I think I've done a good thing. We've got
Sounds good.
We've got a slightly different question now. So this is really interesting, actually. It's from Pamela, and she says, "Does a compost heap need to be an open pile for grass snakes to use it? Rather than one with wooden sides, or I guess the plasticky ones too."
So grass snakes have been known to use practically any compost bin structure available, whether you make it yourself or it's one of the pre-bought ones. It still needs some kind of access. Grass snake females are quite chunky, at least an inch or so thick, and so as long as there's some sort of access, they can definitely get into most structures. And I've heard of them in plastic ones and wooden ones. Really, the key thing for grass snakes is that it needs to be warm enough to incubate the eggs that they lay within the compost heap. And so normally we say that it's better if it is in quite a sunny location. That's what's probably going to increase your chances of the grass snake successfully using it to lay their eggs in.
Okay. Yeah, no, I would love to see some in my garden. I think I don't stand much chance, but it would be incredible if I could. But there's a related question here, actually, is how old are grass snakes actually before they breed?
So with a lot of our reptile species, it's around 4-year mark that the females become sexually mature. So they've already had to survive quite a lot of the challenges that are out in our landscape, and so if they're really lucky, a small percentage get to that age, and then they're the mature females which are going around looking for the compost heaps.
And our next question is from Lynn. So Lynn is from the Bryn Coch Environment Group, which is one of the members of our local nature partnership, and I just have to give that group a bit of a shout out, because they've been running, I think you've been involved as well, Mark, they've been running toad patrols in the spring for going on 13 years or 14 years, I think. And Lynn recently told me that last year in 2019, they actually moved nearly 800 toads from the roads into their breeding ponds, which is just amazing. So a bit of a shout out for Bryn Coch Environment Group with amazing work.
Excellent. Yeah, I know Lynn well. Yeah, good to see that she's still keeping busy.
She is, and she's asked a related question to what we were talking about earlier. She said, "What would the frog tadpoles feed on if you raised them in a tank? And wouldn't you have to use rainwater or water from the pond?"
Yeah. So from a water point of view, it's definitely better to use something like rainwater, or if you can, water from the pond. If you don't have access to that, normally the general advice is that if you can only get access to tap water, but if you leave it for a number of days, or ideally longer than that, that does apparently kind of dissipate some of the things like chlorine that are in the water. And then from a feeding tadpoles point of view, I normally recommend that if people just put some vegetation from the pond and kind of a bit of even leaf litter, they're generally feeding on kind of algae and other kind of some creatures that have died in the pond, and normally they do kind of nibble on those for a while, and there is a certain stage as they get a little bit older where they're quite keen to increase the amount of protein they're eating. So normally I just generally recommend natural materials that you can get from your pond and the surrounding area. Make sure there's enough. So having regular water changes is quite critical to keep your tadpoles healthy. And then, just not really related to this, but I may as well say it now, a point that's really important is that when they start getting to a stage where they're getting their little tiny back legs and they're thinking about changing into tiny little frogs, you need to make sure they have access somewhere they can easily climb out of the water. Otherwise, they basically got rid of their gills to grow the rest of their body, and so they can't breathe like fish can in the water, so they need to get on land. So you need to either, if they're in a tank, put it on at an angle, so one part of it is always out of the water, or obviously if you're careful you can put bits of wood and rocks in there to keep them somewhere for them to go.
And I've seen them eating an unfortunate snail as well that fell into the pond.
Yeah, any invertebrates or things fall in, or another tadpole that's died, unfortunately. They don't mind being cannibalistic in their behaviours to get some protein.
Yep, that's nature, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. A few more sort of tadpole and frog spawn questions. We've actually got a really sad observation from Susie, who said that she saw some toad tadpoles on Sunday, but the stream has dried up now, and I've seen this as well. But is there any chance some of them might survive somewhere, or that this is quite sad, isn't it? There's not much you can do.
Again, it's another thing that we do often get calls about, people worried about that their pond or stream or ditch is drying up and the tadpoles are looking like they're not going to survive. It's especially with frogs, which normally you do find in kind of situations like that. Their scientific name is Rana temperaria, because they're known to favour temporary ponds. So it's their kind of behavioural strategy to go for little puddles and tyre tracks and small ponds that have the potential to dry up, because that normally means that they don't have many invertebrate predators like dragonfly larvae and stuff in them. And so, there is always that risk they're unfortunately going to dry up. So it is unfortunately just part of nature. Somewhere within a landscape, some of them will normally survive, but I appreciate that that people that have got their own little situation with their own little tadpoles is not ideal. The normal advice that we give in that sort of situation, sometimes people say, is it okay for me to move tadpoles from here to there? Normally, our general advice is don't, unless you feel like you absolutely have to, because the risk of moving something is, firstly, you could be spreading some sort of amphibian disease, ones that we know about or ones that haven't been discovered yet. And a lot of amphibians around the globe are declining or going extinct because of the risk of disease. The other factor is invasive plant species. So unless you're really good on your botany skills, in any of the kind of pond or ditch that you're worried about where the tadpoles are drying up, it might have some really quite aggressive plant species, which if they get into your pond, if you're transplanting them, say, to your pond, they can completely take over your pond and ruin it. So that's the risk. But sometimes people are quite insistent, or they're saying, isn't it okay if I move some tadpoles? And our normal rule of thumb is that if the pond or the ditch is within 1 kilometre, then from a disease point of view, it's unlikely that you're going to be spreading a disease, because that disease is likely to be in that area, in that landscape already. So we don't normally worry too much about that, but you've still got the risk of the invasive plant species.
So Lynn, earlier, who asked a question earlier, is actually asking a related question now. She's just wondering if chytrid fungus is still a big problem for amphibians.
Yeah, so for those of you that aren't aware of what chytrid fungus is, it's you might have seen it on some kind of nature documentaries over the past kind of decade or so. So it's this disease which has been wiping out quite a lot of amphibian populations across the globe, in like South America and Australia and other places, also in Europe. And yeah, we do have it in the UK, and some people, maybe Lynn was involved in doing some swabbing of amphibians about 10 years ago, the big swab that was done to see whether, how it was affecting our amphibians. And it appears, like I said, we do have it, but we don't seem to be having widespread declines because of it in the UK. So we're not too worried about that one at the minute, but it's worth keeping on the radar. But there is another chytrid fungus which has been found more recently, which is unfortunately a bit more concerning, because it was originally found in the Netherlands, but it's not actually from this area. It's somehow got into our population through Asian salamanders, so people keeping salamanders and newts as pets, and unfortunately through whatever practice, maybe they would tip some water into stream or some sort of plant material from their captive collection, but it's got out anyway into our wild species. And so it's been having really dramatic declines of fire salamanders across Europe, especially in the Netherlands. They've completely crashed. And unfortunately, this particular new chytrid fungus, which they're calling the salamander eater, it does affect grey-crested newts. So we don't have it wild in the UK at the minute, but it has been found in captive populations in the UK. So we do need to be on the watch out. So if anyone comes across any dead, especially amphibians and reptiles in their garden, but possibly other species as well, there is a project called the Garden Wildlife Health Project, and you can send a photograph of the animal that's either still alive but not looking very well, or dead, and they'll have a look at it, and then possibly they'll actually want you to post them the carcass, and they'll analyse it and do a post-mortem and see what diseases. It's well worth doing that.
Okay, so that's a good tip. I'll put the link to that in the comments of the video. So thanks for that question, Lynn. Should we have a little break and try and do the sounds that we've prepared? So I'm gonna play it a call, and then Mark's gonna tell us about it. So we'll start with this one.
Oh yeah, you can make it out.
Okay.
So yes, and that which might not be particularly clear for people, but you get the picture. There's quite a loud churring noise going on there, and so that was from a natterjack toad, which is our rarest amphibian in Wales, and there's only populations in North Wales where we've ARC have reintroduced them onto some of the sand dunes up there. And so so the male and lots of males together make this amazing noise at night, which can be heard across the dunes. So if you're ever visiting any dune systems in North Wales, or you can find out other dune systems in the UK, it's worth going for a stroll in the dunes at night to pick up that amazing noise that they make.
I've been really lucky, and I have been up to the dunes in North Wales and seen them, and they're so sweet, aren't they? They're quite small, and they've got that yellow stripe down their back, so they're quite distinctive from the common toad.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So that is the key ID feature, the line down the back. So again, it's very unlikely that you're going to see them in your garden. Sometimes we do have the odd comment coming in with people saying, "Oh, I think I've got a natterjack in my garden," and maybe they just had a quick look online to try and ID it, and they got a bit confused. But it is all about that line. So that's the key feature.
Louise is asking here, how deep does the pond have to be?
So, like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like any pond is great, and so even quite a shallow pond will do the job. Something like a pretty small, but it's good to have a variation of depth, and ideally a variation of ponds with different depths if you can. But obviously some people are a bit more limited. So ideally, especially if we're talking about frogs, which is one of the commonest amphibians you'll get in your garden, they can survive with a very shallow pool, and that's where they like to spawn. But quite often, some of the individuals in a population of the males of the frogs can hibernate in the bottom of the pond. And so really they want a pond with a bit more depth to it. We're talking at least a couple of feet in the core, the middle of the pond, to allow them to hibernate safely. Otherwise, unfortunately, during the winter, if it freezes over or it gets very cold, then it's not deep enough for them to survive the frost. So if you can have a slightly deeper middle to your pond, if you've got enough space, then do that, but don't worry if you can't.
Okay. Well, there's actually a question that might lead on from this here, from Suzanne, and she says the last few years their frog spawn was laid early and it doesn't seem to be surviving, so potentially it could be the newts, but could that also be a temperature issue? And like you say, if they can hibernate at the bottom of a deep pond, would a deep pond would help with that, or is there anything else they could do?
It's hard to say without knowing all of the exact details, but one thing, if they are spawning quite early, if she is actually getting frost or actual the pond frozen, then quite often that kills the spawn, and you can see it kind of goes an unhealthy colour, the actual eggs, or it kind of actually damages. It makes the spawn doesn't look normal. It's kind of like disintegrates to a certain extent. But if it's not doing that for that reason, then I'm not exactly sure why she's having an issue. It could well be that the newts are eating them. But if it's not that, then I don't know whether it's a very shaded pond and they're just not getting enough light. But yeah, I'd say probably in that situation, adding more depth probably isn't going to help if it's something wrong with the spawn. So I'd say keep a lookout and see what's going on with the pond and try and work out what's going on.
Okay. I think that might be our last question. Oh, we've got one more here actually, which is useful for everyone across Wales. Is if you want to get involved in amphibian and reptile conservation in Wales, what can you do? Can you volunteer with ARC?
Yes. So across southern Wales, you can get involved in our National Lottery Heritage Fund project, Connecting the Dragons. So that's mainly Pembrokeshire all the way to Monmouthshire. We do, and also we are doing a little bit of work up around Borth and Aberystwyth because there's some sand lizards up there. So yeah, mainly, but otherwise it's Pembrokeshire to Monmouthshire, not really Mid Wales. Unfortunately, we don't have much going on, or in the Brecon Beacons at the minute. And then in terms of ARC in North Wales, then we've got another officer, Mandy Cartwright, who you can get in contact with she's mainly doing stuff in the northeast, but she does cover the whole of North Wales. And otherwise, you can get involved in your local amphibian and reptile group. So you can Google them and see where your local group is.
That's brilliant. I'll put the links to those in the comments as well. And actually, just a quick last question from me. I've just thought, is there any books that people, or ID guides that people could use to help them ID the different amphibians and reptiles in the UK?
Yeah, so I'd say the best one for kind of a good overview, but not going into too much detail. There's one by Howard Innes, and he's a trustee of ARC, and so that's quite. I can't remember the exact name of it. It's like amphibian and reptile identification or something like that. But it does have quite good background information about the species. And then I guess the other one beyond that, a bit more detailed, is the New Naturalist on Amphibians and Reptiles by Beebe and Griffiths. That's a bit more expensive, but if you really want a lot of detail and you're interested about all the history and stuff and a lot of background, then you could have a look for that one.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Mark. That's been really interesting. I hope everyone's had their questions answered, and yes, thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you for organising it.
So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in and listening to our amphibian and reptile Q&A, all about our garden dragons. We hope you've learned a lot and had your questions answered. This event was held as part of Wales Nature Week 2020. We have a few more events for you to take part in this week. So tonight, it's Thursday the 4th, there is a quiz from the local environmental record centres in Wales, the Big Wales Nature Quiz. And you can tune into that on YouTube. You can find the links to all of these events in our events list on our Facebook page, NPT Wildlife. Tomorrow night we have a bats event, hoping the weather plays ball for us. So tune into that. That will be at 9:10 on Friday night. On Saturday, it's Wellbeing Day for Wales Nature Week, and we're handing over to our colleagues in Snowdonia Local Nature Partnership, and they'll be hosting a session of garden yoga at 10 a.m. And you'll need to head to their Facebook page to take part in that. And lastly, on Sunday, the last day of Wales Nature Week, we're going to look at our feathered friends. And Laura from the Neath Talbot Council Countryside and Wildlife team will be on hand to answer all your questions and show off the birds that she's got in her garden. So tune into those events and stay involved and take part in our Neath Talbot Wild Challenges. They'll be released every day at 10:30 a.m. and there's prizes to be won during Wales Nature Week.